While the rest of continental Europe was being systematically destroyed, Sweden's industrial output expanded, its living standards held, and its companies posted profits. By the time the war ended, Sweden was one of the wealthiest nations in Europe, and one of the few that had not been bombed, invaded, or bankrupted. The standard explanation is neutrality. Sweden stayed out of the war, made principled choices under extreme pressure, and emerged intact because of those choices. The wartime record tells a more specific story than that. The post-war story presents Sweden as a case study in small nation pragmatism, surrounded by German-occupied territory, with a coastline Germany could reach and an army that couldn't hold a Wehrmacht offensive, making limited accommodations to survive. King Gustav V and the Swedish government faced constraints that most countries in their position didn't survive at all. That pressure was real. But the gap is in what Sweden was actually doing inside those constraints. It wasn't making the minimum concessions to keep Germany from invading. It was supplying Germany with materials German war production couldn't replace, transporting German soldiers through its territory to the Eastern Front, and continuing both long after it was clear which side was winning. It stopped only when Allied pressure made continuing economically and diplomatically costly. Swedish policy shifts track German military fortune with a precision that's difficult to attribute to anything except calculation. A calculated position, held as long as it paid and adjusted the moment it stopped, isn't neutrality. It's something more deliberate than that. Every panzer rolling off a German assembly line in 1940 needed armor plate. Making that plate required iron ore with an exceptionally low phosphorus content. German domestic deposits and the captured French fields in Lorraine were high in phosphorus. That made the steel brittle, and it forced foundries through expensive enrichment processes before it was usable for a tank turret. Swedish ore from the Kiruna and Gällivare mines went into the furnace clean and came out as high tensile armored plate without the detour. That difference, measured in phosphorus parts per million, is why Germany needed Sweden specifically. Not just iron ore, generically. Securing reliable access to that ore was a central motive behind Germany's invasion of Norway in April 1940, alongside control of the Norwegian coastline and preempting Allied landings. The operational core of the decision was Narvik, Sweden's winter shipping route, the channel through which Swedish ore moved when the Baltic froze and the inland rail lines became the only viable option. Secure Narvik, and Germany secured the ore supply year-round. Lose it, and the winter months became a production crisis. During the critical years of 1939 and 1940, when German rearmament was at its most furious pace, roughly 40% of Germany's total iron ore requirements came from Swedish mines. Germany could draw on substitutes if it had to, but doing so meant lower quality output, higher energy costs, and slower throughput at precisely the moment the war demanded the most. Strip Swedish ore out of those early years, and German steel production doesn't just dip. It strains badly, and everything downstream, tanks, guns, warships, becomes harder to build and slower to replace. Winston Churchill understood this as precisely as the Germans did. He had been pressing to cut off the Norwegian ore route, and had even drawn up plans to occupy the Swedish mining districts at Kiruna and Gällivare entirely, to physically deny them to the Reich before Germany could move. He called the interruption of the ore supply one of the few levers that might shorten the war by months rather than years. Germany read the same map and moved first. Sweden kept the oar moving regardless. After Norway and Denmark fell, Swedish exports didn't stop. Sweden negotiated the terms under which it would continue supplying the power that had just occupied its neighbors. And its neutrality made that arrangement more valuable to Germany than occupation would have been. Ore flowing from occupied territory could be targeted, but from a recognized neutral, it sat behind international law that the Allies couldn't easily pierce without risking pushing Sweden into Berlin's arms. Full supply, no occupation costs, and a legal shield around the most critical raw material in the German war economy. By 1940, German soldiers were boarding Swedish trains at the border crossing at Charlottenburg, officially classified as unarmed leave personnel, framed as the minimum concession necessary to keep Germany from deciding a cooperative neighbor wasn't worth maintaining. Between 1940 and 1943, German soldiers made over 2 million journeys through Swedish territory, rotating back and forth between Germany and the Norwegian occupation forces, the same garrisons traveling the same Swedish rail lines repeatedly. More than 100,000 wagons of German military supplies moved the same route. Sweden had become a crucial logistics artery for German Norway, massively reducing the need for vulnerable sea convoys through waters the Royal Navy contested. All of it was a direct violation of Article 2 of the Hague Convention of 1907, which explicitly forbids moving troops or munitions across neutral territory. Stockholm knew this. London protested it. The transits kept running. Stockholm could justify the arrangement to itself. Germany had encircled the country, the options were limited, the concession framed as the minimum necessary to survive. Then Germany issued an ultimatum in June 1941, and Sweden accepted something that justification couldn't cover. They permitted the transit of the 163rd Infantry Division, the Engelbrecht Division, commanded by General Erwin Engelbrecht, from Norway through Swedish territory to Finland, where it would join the German forces opening the northern axis of the invasion of the Soviet Union. A combat-ready formation, fully armed, moving to a front that was about to open. Sweden knew what Barbarossa was. The German build-up in the east had been visible for weeks. The division transited regardless. The episode became known as the Midsummer Crisis. There was a genuine political fight inside Sweden. Members of the government pushed back, public opinion was deeply divided, and the decision was controversial enough that Parliament debated it afterward. Post-war accounts, drawing from Prime Minister Per Albin Hansen's own diaries, describe King Gustav V threatening to abdicate if the government refused the transit. Some modern historians argue the crisis was exaggerated after the fact to shield the elected government from blame by shifting it to the monarchy. Whatever the truth of that, the pressure inside the cabinet was undeniable. And the outcome wasn't in question. The division transited, and the distinction between unarmed garrison rotation and an armed combat formation heading to Barbarossa isn't a footnote. It's the line between accommodation and active participation in a war of aggression. A Swedish engineer named Sven Wingqvist invented the self-aligning ball bearing in 1907. The company he founded in Gothenburg, SKF, became the world's largest ball bearing manufacturer. And by the time the Second World War began, almost every piece of military equipment with moving parts depended on what SKF's factories produced. Tanks, aircraft engines, submarine drive shafts, artillery traverse mechanisms. The entire mechanical architecture of modern warfare ran on precision ball bearings, manufactured to tolerances that only a handful of factories in the world could reliably hit. The Allies understood what that meant. The Schweinfurt raids of 1943, which cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers in a single day, were targeted specifically at Germany's domestic ball bearing production. The factories at Schweinfurt were home to VKF, Vereinigte Kugellagerfabriken, the German subsidiary of SKF itself. The Americans were bombing a Swedish-owned factory to close a supply gap that Sweden was simultaneously keeping open from Gothenburg. German stockpiles bought time, and dispersed production facilities reduced the immediate damage. But SKF Sweden helped close the gap faster than Allied planners had expected, and kept it closed through the months when it mattered. Swedish ball-bearing exports continued flowing east throughout the period when Schweinfurt was supposed to be creating an irreplaceable production bottleneck. The Allies were paying with aircrew lives to destroy what neutral suppliers were quietly replacing. Allied diplomatic pressure eventually forced Sweden to begin reducing exports in 1944. The same year, the war's outcome was no longer seriously in question. By then, the window had already closed. By the summer of 1943, the Wehrmacht had lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front and would not recover it. Sweden's shift didn't come only from reading the war correctly. During the cooperation years, while the rail lines were carrying German soldiers and the mines were feeding German steel production, the Swedish military had been quietly rebuilding. Defense expenditure that had been negligible before the war dominated the state budget by the early 1940s. By that point, Sweden could mobilize approximately 300,000 troops, considerably more than Germany had committed to taking Denmark and Norway combined, and far better equipped than they had been in 1939. A German operational study that year, drafted by General Adolf von Schell and known as Fall Sweden, concluded that an invasion would require 17 divisions, a full panzer corps, and absolute air superiority that Berlin could no longer spare. Sweden could afford to become more resistant because Germany was losing, and because it had spent 3 years quietly building the deterrent that made resistance viable. That August, the transit agreements were terminated. The ore and bearing shipments began their slow reduction under Allied pressure, and Sweden started allowing Norwegian and Danish resistance networks to operate from its territory with a freedom it had spent 3 years denying them. 2 official Swedish government commissions eventually examined what those 3 years had actually amounted to: the Commission on Jewish Assets in Sweden and the subsequent exhaustive report on Sweden's relations with Nazism, completed in the early 2000s. Neither produced conclusions Stockholm could be proud of. Both acknowledged that Sweden had made far-reaching concessions, that the scale of cooperation went beyond what survival alone required, and that Swedish companies and the state had derived measurable economic benefit. The language was careful, as government commissions tend to be. But what the findings pointed to, stated plainly, was that Sweden had not simply been neutral. It had been profitable. 40% of Germany's iron ore in the critical early years of the war. Over 2 million journeys by German soldiers through Swedish rail lines. SKF ball bearings filling the gap the Schweinfurt raids were supposed to create. The fully armed Engelbrecht division transiting to Barbarossa after Sweden accepted a German ultimatum. Germany never needed to invade. It was already receiving everything occupation would have delivered, without the cost of garrisoning an occupied country or absorbing the diplomatic damage of an unprovoked invasion. No wartime supply arrangement was more efficient than a declared neutral, and collected accordingly. If that changes how you think about neutrality, drop it in the comments. And if you want more history that follows the evidence rather than the official version, subscribe and like this video. Thanks for watching.